I've always believed that my job here was to represent my constituents, and my loyalty and my fidelity was to them, not to any party or any person in Congress. And I'm hopeful that we'll continue to send people like that to Washington, because that's the only way you get things done, and you see a real reflection of what the American people want.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Capehart podcast on Washington Post Live. I am Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, Democrat of Florida, was first elected to Congress in 2016, and she is busy. She is a member of the powerful House Ways and Means Committee. As a member of the House Armed Services Committee, she'll have her eyes on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And as a member of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol, yes, that is the official title, she will soon be part of nationally televised hearings that will bring the Select Committee's findings to light. But late last year, Congresswoman Murphy announced she would not seek a fourth term. Why? Let's find out. Joining me now is Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy of Florida. Welcome to Capehart on Washington Post Live.
It's so great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So since late last month, Congresswoman, we've watched Russia invade Ukraine, sending hundreds of thousands of people streaming into neighboring countries to flee the violence. I would love your reflections on what you're seeing, not only as a member of Congress, member of the Armed Services Committee, but also as a refugee yourself. You grew up here in the Washington area, but your parents fled Vietnam in the late 70s when you were 6 months old, just 6 months old. The boat you all were on ran out of fuel, but you were rescued by a U.S. Navy vessel. Do I have that right? And talk about what your story, how that informs what you're watching and how you're responding to what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, so let me just first say that my heart is just breaking for the Ukrainian people. And I am also just incredibly inspired by their courage. It's not the exact same kind of parallel, because I came from a country, Vietnam was, not overrun by outside invaders the way that Ukraine is facing an unprovoked aggression by Russia. But when I look at these images of women and children and families fleeing violence, it reminds me of the stories that I grew up with in my own home, of my parents talking about living in a war-torn country and worrying about the future for their children, wanting what we as all parents want, which is simply for our children to have a better life than the one that we had. Because they didn't feel like they could have that in Vietnam, as a communist government was taking over and persecuting its own people. My parents decided that they'd take their chances at sea rather than to live on in darkness in this country where they were being oppressed, and that their children wouldn't have a bright future. And so you're correct, we set off by boat when I was just 6 months old and ran out of fuel. And there we were, dangerously adrift, when the U.S. Navy came upon our ship and refueled us, resupplied us, and allowed us to make it to a Malaysian refugee camp. And then from there, Lutheran Church relocated us to Virginia. And so as I watch these images, it resonates deeply with me from a personal perspective. But from a professional perspective, I think it's so important that America stand up and stand beside these freedom-loving people who are trying to defend their country against this naked aggression. And they have a right to their sovereignty and their territorial integrity. And I just voted here in Congress on a resolution in support of Ukraine. And I look forward to voting for resources to back up our commitment to help the Ukrainian people.
Is there more the United States should be doing or could be doing to help the Ukrainians, the government and the Ukrainian people? There are a lot of people who talk about, the United States, I think President Zelensky wants there to be a no-fly zone The president doesn't want to do it, doesn't say that that's the right move. Your view on that?
Well, a no-fly zone gets very complicated because the president has made clear he does not want U.S. troops facing off with Russian troops. And if you implement a no-fly zone, what that means is that you're going to have to enforce it. And that would put U.S. forces face to face with Russian forces. And that's not something that we're looking at right now. What I do think that we need to look at is to impose costs in all manners possible, diplomatic, military, and economic. And from the diplomatic perspective, I think we're doing a good job working with our allies, coordinating and standing strong and united as NATO against this aggression and supporting Ukraine. From a military perspective, we continue to provide supplies and military assets for the Ukrainians to be able to try to defend themselves and counter this aggression. And then from the economic perspective, we need to impose costs on the Russian economy, and we are already seeing good progress on really trying to bring the Russian economy to its knees. And then from a social perspective as well, I advocated to, kick them out of the World Cup competition. It may seem like a small thing, but Russia and its people needs to understand that they will be a pariah if they continue to advance this invasion of Ukraine. And so we're working on a lot of different fronts where we can work together with our allies to impose costs on Russia for its violation of international norms.
One of the criticisms of President Biden's State of the Union address that I heard was that there was a lot of tough talk about Russia, punishing Russia, making sure Russia pays for its invasion of Ukraine, and no reaching out to the Russian people and saying to the Russian people, making a distinction between the Russian people and the Russian government. Do you think that the president should have extended that kind of rhetorical branch to the Russian people, or was that not necessary?
I think some of the imposing the cost, the Russian people will be impacted by that cost, but they also, it's part of the pressure campaign, that the pressure needs to come from the outside and the inside on Putin to rethink this miscalculation of invading Ukraine. And if the oligarchs and the people of Russia allow their government to invade Ukraine without any consequences, they won't speak up. They need to feel the impacts of their government's decisions and then choose to make their own choices about what they say and what they do within their own country. The pressure needs to come from the inside and the outside.
Are you surprised by the incredible unity that we have seen within NATO, within the European Union, the United Kingdom, the West against Russian President Vladimir Putin? Because the conventional wisdom is Putin thought that the alliance was fractured and that the alliance wouldn't come together in the way that it has so quickly against him. Are you surprised by just how resolute the Western alliance has been against Putin?
I am heartened. I worked at the Department of Defense in the early 2000s at a time when NATO was trying to figure out what its purpose was. The threat wasn't as imminent as it was when they were established, and they were casting about, lots of conversation about what was the purpose of NATO. And I think in one fell swoop, Putin has managed to accomplish the absolute opposite of what he wanted. He wanted to push the U.S. out of Europe, and instead the U.S. is deploying thousands of troops to Europe to deter further aggression and basically reassure our NATO allies. He wanted to divide the NATO alliance and fracture US-EU relations. And instead, as you said, he has unified these countries in an unpredictable and unprecedented way. He wanted to quickly defeat Ukraine on the battlefield. And look, he is facing the kind of courageous resistance of freedom-loving people who are fighting to defend their country. They are putting up such a fierce fight, and they're inflicting heavy damage on Russian forces. and also exposing, for our purposes, the shortcomings in the Russian military and their logistics challenges and other weaknesses that is important for us to know. And at the end of the day, I think Putin wanted to show that Russia was a global power, and he wanted to reclaim something that never really was there for them. And instead, what he has done is he's made Russia a pariah nation, and he's also deeply damaged the Russian economy. So I am heartened and encouraged by how our allies have pulled together, and freedom-loving people around the world have showed up to provide support for the Ukrainian people.
I'm going to get you one more question on this, because I've got two big chunks of this interview, that two other topics that I want to get to. But you mentioned that you were a national security specialist at the Department of Defense back in the day, before you were a member of Congress. And I'm curious, how much damage did the previous administration do to the Western alliance by downplaying and bad-mouthing NATO, by not actively saying that it would support Article 5 of the NATO Charter? Did that give, you think, President Putin a false sense of security, that when push came to shove, the NATO alliance would not come together and respond in the way that it has?
I certainly don't think that the last administration's coddling of Russia was helpful on many fronts. But what I would say is that this administration stands in stark contrast to the last administration. Last night, we heard the president on the State of the Union affirm our commitment to Article 5. While there will not be troops deployed into Ukraine, he has made it very clear that we will defend every piece of territory under our NATO alliance. And we are sending forces there to make sure that Putin understands that we are serious about our commitment. I also think that this administration has done a good job diplomatically corralling all of our allies and leading. I'm somebody who believes that American leadership is so critically important in this world, and it's really heartening to see a change of pace. And I'll add that the last administration isn't done undermining our efforts to stand together in this moment of crisis in Europe. It is stunning to imagine that a former president would admire President Putin and Putin's aggression against another nation in the aftermath of the invasion. When we look at the humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding there, and these people fighting for their democracy, how can you stand on the side of Putin?
Well, let's keep talking about him, meaning the former president of the United States, and bring it closer to home. And that is the work that you're doing as a member of the January 6th Select Committee. There were reports or talks that both Rudy Giuliani, who was Trump's personal attorney, and Ivanka Trump, Donald Trump's daughter, have been in touch with the committee about impending testimony, or about whether they're going to testify. One, do you have any news on that? And two, do you really think that they'll actually come in voluntarily and testify?
Well, I really appreciate your question, as it is among the questions all over DC media. Can you give me the dirt on what's going on with the committee? And the answer is I
don't
really
want
can't.
dirt. I'm just looking for answers.
Yeah, well, we really need to protect the integrity of the investigation that we are conducting, because it matters whether or not somebody who's coming before our committee knows what we know. And so we are being very deliberate about it. What I will say, though, is that January 6th isn't too far afield from what we're talking about in Ukraine. Autocratic forces are on the march in the world today. And as Americans, we need to stand up and defend democracy, whether that is overseas or here at home. And a core tenet of our democracy here at home is a free and fair election, and the ability for people to accept the results after they have exhausted the constitutionally accepted process. When we got to January 6th, the courts had already settled the cases. We cannot find ourselves in a situation where elected leaders find whatever loophole they can to try to hold on to power, because that makes us no better than any autocracy in this world. And so what is at stake is democracy, and that's why it's so important as a member of the select committee that we protect the integrity of the investigation and not really comment on some of your questions.
Okay, but that doesn't mean I don't have another question.
Okay.
So Chairman Benny Thompson was here. I interviewed him and I asked him, would there be televised hearings? He said yes, and that they would be in prime time. My question to you is, when?
We are still deep in the process of collecting the information and doing the investigation, but we also realize that we have the obligation and the opportunity to share the information that we have collected with the American people in a way that is consumable. I think too often up here in Washington, we talk in terms of reports, dense reports, and legislative language, and we don't tell enough of the story. And so as a committee, we're committed to telling the story of how we found ourselves on the precipice, how we found our democracy on the precipice on January 6th, and how we can fix some of the weaknesses within our democracy. After all, we're ever evolving, and it is incumbent upon one generation after the next to reinforce our democracy and to ensure that no one strong man or one strong person can corrupt our Constitution and undermine our democracy.
As a member of the Select Committee, have you learned things? I'm not asking for specifics, but have you learned things that just made your jaw drop? Things that we in the general public don't know about, but you were there on January 6th. You're a member of Congress. Have you learned things that you didn't even know had happened or were happening, and when you were living it in real time?
I absolutely have learned things that are shocking and deeply, deeply disturbing. You have to understand that I came from a country that was a democracy until it wasn't. And when I was at the Department of Defense, I worked with countries around the world that were fledgling democracies who had situations like coups and had to work on bolstering their democracy. So I understand the fragility of our democracy. I don't take it for granted any day that I'm here, that I have the greatest privilege to live in the greatest country in the world, but that it is a part of my responsibility to ensure that our next generation benefits from our economic system as well as our governance system if we can protect it. And so I have learned some shocking things, because we're looking at not just what happened on that day and of the people who are household names and their roles in this incident. We are also looking at the organizations and folks at the local and state level who had a role in trying to overturn a free and fair election. We're looking at where the money is going. We're looking at how disinformation played a part in this setting up the scene for what happened on January 6th. There's a lot that we have learned through the tens of thousands of documents that we have received, as well as the folks who have come before us and have been willing to provide testimony.
Man, if you were shocked, then I am really, I'm a nerd, so I was already looking forward to the televised hearings, but now I'm really interested. So no matter what happens in the midterms, one of the big concerns is, will the committee wrap up its investigations and everything in time for the midterms? And I'll leave that to the side. But no matter what happens in the midterms, you will not be coming back to Congress. You are considered a rising star in the Democratic Party. So why did you decide not to run for re-election?
Well, I am a working parent, just like anybody else who's a working parent. And my husband works as well. And we have a 7 and an 11-year-old. And working parents sometimes have to make a decision between their professional ambitions and their personal responsibilities. And my kids are going through a stage that I really want to be there. I want to drive carpool. I want to know who their friends are. And that's really hard to do as a member who represents a swing district and in the House where you're in cycle pretty much all the time. So I'm taking a beat, but I'm young enough, I think, by political terms, to not rule out some future at a later date when it makes more sense for my family.
Senate, governor?
Well, I'll just say that Senate and governor isn't on the same 2-year hamster wheel cycle, and it does provide a bit more stability than the swing district in the U.S. House. But who knows? I left the Department of Defense in 2008 with no real vision for how I would continue in public service, and I found my way back anyways. I owe this country a lot, so who knows?
And twice you've talked about the fact that you represent a swing district. How much of the fact that it is a swing district, did you look at the impending campaign and think, in this swing district, the district is going to swing away from me, and so why go through that if I see that I won't win re-election anyway?
No, I honestly didn't. This really is about a personal decision. I ran a race, my first race, what people told me was an impossible race. I launched a 4-month campaign against a 24-year Republican incumbent who had been the chair of a big committee. And everybody, including the Democrats in my region, told me there is no way you're going to win. And yet we pulled it off anyways. And I've run tough races since, and I always overperform Democrats. And so I wasn't really worried about going into this cycle because I know that I work hard in my district, my brand is strong, and I don't go by way of national trends.
Okay, so since you're leaving, that means you can talk real talk here.
Okay.
Right now, you are a co-chair of the Blue Dog Coalition, translation, centrists, not the progressive end, not the conservative end, but right in the middle. Do you believe that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has taken control of the party's agenda to the detriment of the Democratic Party?
I worry about moderates on both sides of the aisle in the next Congress. Both the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party have forces on the far left and the far right that are trying to co-opt the broad part of their party. Instead of launching a third party, they figured it was just easier to take over the conventional one. And so there are a lot of resources that are applied to ensure party unity. Just look at the 13 Republicans who dared to vote for clean water and safe roads and bridges. They received so much incoming from their own party, and they are now being primaried like there's no tomorrow. And then on the Democratic side, we're not immune from having outside groups come after the moderates. I'm worried that in the next Congress, these forces will make it impossible for the shrinking number of moderates to reach across the aisle and work together. But as the president noted last night, a lot of his major achievements were led and pushed across the finish line by moderates and were bipartisan bills. Just take the infrastructure bill, for example. He lauded the impact that that bill has been having on districts all across this country. Well, that bill wouldn't have gotten across the finish line but for moderates and people working in a bipartisan way to craft legislation that can improve the lives of American people. So I think post-redistricting and some of these outside forces might degrade Congress's ability to serve this country. And for that, I'm really worried.
What do you say to the progressives who say, all we're trying to do back then is protect and push forward the president's agenda as it was described then under Build Back Better? During the State of the Union address, the president didn't use the words Build Back Better, but he talked about the individual pieces of what used to be Build Back Better. Do you think that the president and that the Democratic Party should go at it again by trying to get bits and pieces of what was known as Build Back Better, like the child income tax credit or child care, health care, and things like that, get those done individually?
I would say that I shared the same goal as my progressive colleagues and the White House, which is to get a bill across the finish line or bills across the finish line that had components of the president's priorities. I, however, have a very pragmatic approach to legislating in Congress. And what I look at is what is the broadest set of common ground that we have that has 218 in the House and that can pass an evenly divided Senate. And if we have to scope our expectations to what has the votes, we should do that, because at least then you would have a bill for the president to sign and actually do something that impacts the lives of the American people. And so we shared the same goal. I think we just had different approaches and different expectations as to what could successfully get done. Mm-hmm. What I'm hopeful about, because in the President's State of the Union, he mentioned a number of things that I think would have bipartisan support, or at least be able to receive the 218 and make it through the Senate, that we should move forward. I'm particularly pleased that he mentioned the prescription drug piece that I worked hard on with a handful of other moderates to craft to a place that we thought would not only allow Medicare to negotiate, but also cap insulin at $35. And that's something we should look at.
What's your advice to the White House and the House Democrats if they want to hang on to the majority in the midterms?
Stop showing up at a emotional, painful conversation with constituents with data to try to convince them that what they're feeling isn't true. Whether it was inflation or the cost of gas or the rising cost of food or supply chain shortages that are impacting their ability to buy their kids the cleats they need to play soccer, whatever it is, we have to acknowledge that this is what the American people are going through, and then work together to figure out ways to actually solve that problem instead of trying to convince them that it's not really happening. And I saw a bit of that last night. The administration is acknowledging that inflation is an issue, and the president laid out some ways in which he thought he could address it. And reasonable people can have debates about how we do that, but we have to, borrowing some prior politicians' word, feel people's pain, and then work from there.
In the, I think, minute that we have left. So then do I take from what you just said that you think that President Biden has his finger now on the pulse of the country, and that his State of the Union address sort of demonstrated that he understands the pain that they're feeling at the kitchen table level?
I was grateful to see that his State of the Union reflected a more pragmatic approach than the joint address from a year ago, and we're headed in the right direction. And he needs to know that he has allies here in Congress, moderates, progressives, Democrats, Republicans alike, willing to help him help the American people.
Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy of Florida, thank you so much for coming to Capehart on Washington Post Live.
Great to be with you.
And thank you for joining us. To check out what interviews we have coming up, head to WashingtonPostLive.com. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Thanks for watching Capehart on Washington Post Live.